Okay. Hi, Jason. This is Mike with Just Legal History. So I was saying that, as I was saying, I'm not sure if I'm a YouTuber or a podcaster, so still trying to figure this out.
What I
So
am. I am still trying to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. I just stopped
yeah,
growing when I was like in seventh grade. So.
I never grew. I'm short, so that's so. So I guess I wanted to just talk to you kind of about like where I started with true crime and how I jumped in and how that kind of applies to today. Because it's probably been like 5 or 6 years ago that my son CJ got the serial assignment in high school. So they had to listen to the podcast for his one of his high school classes, and actually I ended up being the one that actually listened and liked it, and it got me involved back in the true crime. I guess growing up, I watched it some, watched the different shows, probably Unsolved Mysteries and some of those
Mm-hmm.
too that I've watched through life, but it wasn't very, I didn't watch it too much, but I got back into it with the serial podcast and then watching The Staircase. And so,
And the
and it,
staircase, that's the Michael Peterson one, right?
that was on Netflix, but yeah,
Documentary.
that was a documentary. So, and one of the things that as I was listening to it, like I thought she was missing or that she was not being completely full with what was going on in the background. So at that time, I was able to go out and research what happened in the case. So that's kind of the thing that I wanted to talk to you about, some of the ethics about podcasts or documentaries in general. Like what are the rules? Are they bind? Is there anything that binds them, or is it just a free for all market that there are no rules and the only thing that's really keeping them honest is the market itself of whether or not you can watch it. So
Well, let me throw out just so you and your listeners have an idea of what lens I look at it through. And I look at it through the lens of somebody who is a former journalist. I had worked at the New York Times, at the Boston Globe. I left journalism because of a scandal that I created with stories that were fabricated and plagiarized. But I still hold on to those core journalism ethics, if that makes sense. And I'm a firm believer that journalism has the power to be super impactful and do good things in the world. With that, right, and you can see it in the example of like what happened in my career. With that, there is this, and this was the name of a documentary about me. There is this fragile trust between those who consume news and the people who produce it, and you have to do everything you can to protect that trust. So that's the lens that I look at it through. And so kind of getting at your point about instances where things are getting held back or not, in an example like serial, part of it is really you're always going to have more information than you could possibly use. And as a journalist, you've got to discern a little bit what goes in and what doesn't go in. But one thing that I learned from editors and then people in journalism ethics, whenever you have a thesis for the story, right? Like you think you know what's happening, you need to go out and try to disprove everything that you have. And whatever you collect during that process, you also need to share because that shows the other side of the story. And I think a great example of this, like an absolute great example of this, is Gilbert King's Bone Valley, right? It is a story about Leo Schofield, who was, I think it was 1987. He was either convicted then or that's when it happened. But he was, he was convicted of the murder of his wife, Michelle. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest, right, that he didn't do it. But there's a lot of bad information about him. And if you're being an honest journalist, you share all of it. And that's one of the failings, I think, of Serial, and a failing of Undisclosed, and then a failing of the Bob Ruff podcast that fell afterwards, that each of them seem to, and I think probably to a lesser extent Serial, seem to take a certain angle and narrative and provide information that tended to support that narrative. And basically what you're doing then is breaking that fragile trust with your listeners, because you can see, as you're getting at, in every one of those instances, people have done research on the back end. They've found that there's more to the story, or there are other stories, and they don't trust outlets. And that hurts all of us who are in this space. As a podcaster myself, I think it hurts all of us.
Yeah, that's correct. And so hopefully, I mean, trying to find out from you if you think they've learned that lesson going forward, and hopefully that's something that I, as a listener, or other listeners, can actually trust now when we start to hear these podcasts. When we start Bone Valley for the first time or whatever, we know that they're being completely honest with us. That's just one of the things that I would like them to go forward, to know, like, I don't want to have to double check the staircase or whatever going forward. And so hopefully we've learned that lesson.
I don't think we have, but I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why, and what is a part of, at least in my mind, part of the problem. I think that there's been such a blending in this true crime and crime space of entertainment with journalism, with advocacy, with also with analysis, and each of those things do very different things. In my mind, they should all be honest, right? At a baseline, they should all be honest. But in the world of entertainment, what sells is a compelling counter narrative, something that, you know, seems rare or doesn't happen. And as long as that's what sells, and, you know, people say that's what people want, but I seriously doubt that the documentary industry has a good read on what people want. Because at the end of the day, I think people gravitate toward things like true crime because they want truth, as much as they may want to be entertained. And a great example of this is what Sean Reich, who is the director of Convicting a Murderer, which is the documentary that was meant to counter Making America Murder. They came up with a giant documentary just proving the last documentary. You know, it was a Convicting of Murder is really a media criticism, just proving that the last documentary was wrong. And what Sean told me when I had him on my podcast was that eventually there are going to be enough of these instances where people are totally fooled by documentaries, and people are going to turn away from them. Instead of directors making millions of dollars off of them, it's going to go back to the days when they were making 20,000 because people aren't watching them anymore. People don't like
him. Yeah. So I wanted to bring up one counter, or maybe a counter example, and see, is like Unsolved Mysteries. You know, they rebooted that show. I think that I've heard. And so the problem was, it did seem like when they did some of those episodes, they really tried to make it more a mystery than what it actually was. So you had to go out there and find out some of those stories, what exactly happened, and found out that really there wasn't that much controversy in the background, but Unsolved Mysteries had to kind of make it more of a show, and just they had to make it more of a show and make it a mystery so that they could last the 40 minutes or whatever.
They were stretching the stories beyond, making them more mysterious than they really were. Is that
okay. That's what I got from it. I guess hopefully people in the comments, once this gets posted, can decide and say, yeah, that Unsolved Mysteries was good, and there was no controversy, or they can agree. So let me see what else, other notes that I have, because I wanted, like,
could I jump onto that piece of it?
Sure.
That I also think we're in a very different world, right? When I was growing up and most things were on newspaper, television, and radio, I had very limited resources to check something out, right? I read something in the Washington Post. I could read the New York Times or the Washington Times when I was growing up in the DC area. I could listen to the radio. I could listen to TV. I could compare it. If I really wanted to compare it, I had to go to the local library in Fairfax County when I grew up. Now, checking things out, getting court records, finding out the real details behind the story are just at my fingertips. And I think that's part of the reason why so many of these people who are selling stories that aren't particularly strong are getting caught now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I guess coming from the journalism world, it was kind of harder, but now they can put those stories into a checker and know that it's fabricated right away. I guess I also wanted, I don't know how much it is in the true crime podcast or these worlds, but I have heard of stories of people of plagiarized and it and in fact or that they're just reusing material of other podcasts.
Yes.
So I mean that's something I guess that people have to be. I mean, I guess it's really hard when you cover these big stories like Adnan or Leo or whatever, that as some of the bigger ones start to cover them, finding the new material in them is very hard, and that's
Well, yeah. Well, no, I think you're getting at something. So as you can imagine, I'm like super sensitive to plagiarism. I pick it up often, particularly if it's in a story about myself. But I'm one of those people who read like 15 articles on every topic, and there will be times where I literally will see the exact same phrases. And when I see that, especially for the later stories, I'm like, okay, you didn't do any of your own reporting, so I can't trust what you're saying is true. But honestly, Michael, it's something I see all the time. Now, there is an okay space for that. We're both friends of the Prosecutors Podcast, right? They say we don't do any of our own reporting, and they credit the people that they collect information from. Their podcast is about analysis. But I think the important part is that people are disclosing whether they did original reporting, where they got their information from, because you need to, as the listener, as the viewer, get some kind of read on whether that's trustworthy.
Yeah, and I think they do a very good job of linking their sources at the on when they do it. So yeah, I think that's kind of the model to follow, and hopefully, as I said, other ones will follow it. I guess that's always the hard part is how much you put out.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I also wanted to I also think one of the good things is creating an open dialogue or allowing open discussion for your topics too. And I think some of them really should try. Some are really good, and some really kind of just try and shut that down. So I think that's.
Well, I think we see, to your point, circling back to what you talked about that before, and this kind of links back to the prosecutors, Brett Talley and Alice Secor, who run that podcast last year, did, I think it was like 15 episodes on Adnan Syed. And if you see the messages in their Facebook group, The Gallery, before things started to get really, really heated and controversial, their messages said, essentially, don't attack people for having a different view. We want to hear what you think. We want you to listen to these other podcasts that completely disagree with us, creating an open space. Look on the other side with something like Truth or Justice and Bob Ruff. People are getting kicked out of those groups for offering a different opinion or something contrary to the theme. And I think what that does is it creates an echo chamber. And I, as the person in the echo chamber, believe that my position is strong because there are 20 other people around me who have that same position. I'm having a base rate fallacy, essentially, because I am not accounting for the fact that there are 30 other people who got kicked out of this group or felt uncomfortable in this group who have left. So people begin to feel very self-justified that their sometimes bad information is right. Whereas in Brett and Alice's example, if there was an error in their work, it would have come out, right? People would have pointed it out. Learned. Yeah.
Correct. And I think, yes, and I think Brett and Alice Brett is very good at interacting with the people, whether it's through Twitter and through the Facebook gallery and other spots.
Don't trust that it's not Alice. She never announces herself when she's there, but she's there.
She did. The funniest one was when she watched The Menu with us, and she didn't know it was a horror film until we started watching it. So it was really funny when she got into that. But
I had thought that Brett was their entire social media presence, and then one day I was talking to Alice, and she was quoting all these things that I said on social media. I was like, "Wait a minute."
Yeah, because I think it's important. I guess I think it's important for the podcasters to be a part of their community. So,
well, what do you? I'm curious about what you think about what gets in the way of people creating those open spaces. Is it like pride, or they can't bear that they may have gotten something wrong, or can't stand people disagreeing with them?
problem that I have is making that more general is because the people that I kind of know that did it, it was because of like the specific cases or their specific issues was
Mm.
more driving that than I don't know of everybody else and what they're doing. So I don't want to get too into specifics to say that why a couple of them won't listen and try and understand what could be going on. Because I think in their world they're more, as you broke it down, they're more into the advocacy area, and so when people are questioning their advocacy, that it's getting in the way of their pride in
Yep.
in their job. I mean,
And
I guess for them it is a job. So if you're questioning their job,
yeah, because their mission isn't necessarily the truth. It's to advocate for a point that they happen to think is true. But if advocating for their point means leaving something out, I think most people in those situations, you see it in legal briefs all the time going to the court, where you'll read a legal brief and you're like, wow, that sounds really good, except for you left out these 10 pieces of case law that work against you. And there's nothing wrong with that in advocacy. But if I, as the listener, do not know that your purpose is to be an advocate, and I think you're playing it straight, it runs real risk for me, if that makes sense.
correct. So do you think it should, like, the people that start these podcasts, they should be upfront with what they're trying to do? Like, I don't know how often they have to mention it, but
Yeah.
certainly do they?
Yeah. So I don't think you have to say it 1,000 times, but I think like in your descriptions of your podcast or your intros of your podcast or occasionally on your podcast, explain the lens that you're looking at things through. The example I gave you before about the prosecutors saying, hey, we don't do original reporting usually. I mean, like maybe they'll pick a phone call up every now and then, but their research is based on other things. They're an analytical podcast. Or you get ones like Your Own Backyard, which is Chris Lambert's podcast on the Kristen Smart case that helped sort of move that one toward fruition. And that's more of a journalistic. Same thing with Gilbert King's Bone Valley. That's more of a journalistic one. They disclose what they are. Unfortunately, and I would even put some of my friends as podcasters in this space, they blur the lines about what they are. And many people think that they are different things. And I think it really sets you up for failure because the expectations of you are so varied and you can't be all of those things at once. You can't be an entertainer, a journalist, an advocate, and analytical all at the same time.
Well, sometimes I think a couple of those do kind of blend together, so it's kind of hard to know the differences. But
well, they can. Like journalism and analysis can go together. Even journalism and entertainment can go together. It's really hard for advocacy and journalism to go together. Advocacy and entertainment could go together, but they tend not to like each other. So I'm just sort of thinking about all four at once, really.
Okay. I also wanted another topic kind of on that is like the kind of the air, like I guess when you're the journalist where you're in it, and this is an area that's kind of is really tough, and sometimes because you're like where the line is because because you get into a point where you could go down false lines, and as a journalist I think you have to be very careful about that, especially for like defamation, and we've seen that for several, like let's give a good example of where it worked out, and then one where it didn't, like it worked out but I think for the wrong reason, starting with like In Your Backyard, where he was like he went after the guy, I can't remember, or the guy that that killed Kristen Smart and then the dad. But I mean, he could have gone down this line, could have gone down the line, and then found out that, oh, by the way, he was going after the wrong person. But for him, this one did work out because he did bring to light. They did more investigation, and then eventually there was arrests and trials. So that one was on the good side. One that I thought was kind of was questionable was Up and Vanished. I think season 2 with Tara Grimstad.
Yep,
So
that's a Georgia school teacher.
yeah, and she was like, so she was, or I think what ended up happening was she was robbed and then killed, and then
some of the former students, I think.
Correct, but the way that he approached it was he pretty much blamed the police department for the murder, or the disappearance. I don't know how much you watched that one, and I got the impression, like, you got to be very careful if you're gonna like go down the line and say that this person this group is doing it. I mean, and then you find out that you were totally wrong. What he did was it brought attention to the case. So the Georgia whatever FBI or whatever reopened the case, and they investigated and they found the two brothers who did it. I also think one of the things that he got in or kind of stretch was that there was always a question of which of the two brothers actually killed her and which one covered it up. And so that was kind of one of the things that got in legal problem that I don't think anybody was ever convicted of the murder because they could never figure out which one of the two. And I think the guy that did it actually kind of convinced that it was the other one, like made the reasonable doubt that it was the other person. So it brought forth, I mean, it did good and bad where like, I'm just saying that you got to be very careful as a journalist, like where you set the rules as a journalist when you're trying to,
because sure what his background was, the podcaster. I'm not sure if you know what his background was or what his background is, but I think that I run into people all the time who tell me they want to be investigative podcasters, and I ask about their background, and they may have been a lawyer, or they may have been an advocate, or they may have been something else. But I think a lot of them are not investigators and researchers. And what I can tell you, if I'm writing a 8-part series for the Washington Post, you as the reader are learning the mysteries as the story goes, right? They're unfolding to you. I, as the writer, am not. I know all the answers before I get there. Now, maybe there's some stuff I find out because of the feedback that I'm getting as the stories are being published that then gets incorporated into the final few stories. So if you look at the amount of reporting someone like Gilbert King does before Bone Valley, or Brandon Schrand did before he even started the Snake River Killer podcast, which is about some killings in Chicago and also California and also Idaho and Washington State that are linked together. Or if you look at the reporting that Chris Lambert did before he even uttered his mouth on a podcast, you have more surety of the direction that the story should be going because you've already reported it out, not fully, but you've already reported it out before you started talking. And I struggle with people who haven't seen the investigative process from the inside, trying to do investigative podcasts without learning, right? Maybe working for an investigative podcast, working in a situation where you're doing a lot of research. I think it creates a real challenge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I actually wanted to bring up another example. That one came from came from a book instead of a podcast. Was it the one about the Golden State Killer? Kind of in that same way where she, like Patton Oswalt's wife at the time, just decided to get into it and wrote a book and was investigating it on her own. It brought the story to light, but she wasn't correct with what it happened, but they were able to find it differently. But she was credited because she brought that story forth back into the public.
Correct. But I don't think, if you look at that case, right? Take that case as an example. Now, public pressure can be absolutely helpful. Questions can be helpful. But that was solved because the FBI re-engaged. They opened their case file from the beginning. It was solved because of advances in technology that and also methodology with genetic genealogy. Essentially getting a DNA test got cheaper, and people gave law enforcement access to their DNA. That, I think so often, because podcasts, books, movies get so much attention, I think there's this a false correlation that we make between what we do and these cases coming to resolution, because you'll find just as many that don't come to resolution. So I think often that line about getting attention for a case when someone's made lots of errors or mistakes becomes a way to whitewash what they really did. Hey, I did this, I got it wrong, but hey, I brought attention to the case. Well, that's not why that case was solved.
Yeah, I guess, and another one that was kind of the problem, like I think there was also a problem with somebody that went after one of the professors, like in the Idaho 4 murders, that
Yes.
she became popular and she was going after the wrong guy, and I think she got into a lot of hot water for that too.
There was a
So
TikToker who was going after a woman professor I know about at the University of Idaho killings when what were their names? Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, um, uh,
yeah, I
Ethan
don't.
Pinkman, and then Zana Cornoodle. I always like to say their names every time I talk about them. But in that case, a woman on TikTok accused and kept on accusing an Idaho professor of a female professor at Idaho of being responsible or involved in the killings. And I think that one of the, and you need to go no further than Delphi, right? Uh, you, the Delphi murders of Abby Williams and Liberty Germain, to see, there have all been all these people who have been accused of being suspects. We have a responsibility, if we are going to get into the arena, if we are going to get involved in writing about serious crimes and people who are potential perpetrators and affecting families, we have a moral obligation and a responsibility to handle that with care. And I don't care whether you're an advocate, I don't care whether you are an entertainer or a journalist. Telling people stories is a sacred responsibility. When I get on my podcast, I recently had the father of Breonna Maitland, Bruce Maitland, in. And what I told him in letting me interview him, it is an unbelievable honor to give me this honor to tell your story and to tell and share some of your daughter's story. And I'm going to take that with care, just like it were my mother or my brother being published. And I think, particularly with like the YouTube, got to do a live every day cycle, I just think people don't take that care. And I think they have no business of doing what they're doing, this kind of work. Now, it's a free country. We have a First Amendment and they can do it, but they have no business doing it.
Correct. Yeah, and that's the fine line. Is some of these is, and I mean, some cases that the alternate suspect gets really vocal about it and does stuff about it. I guess the biggest one is the John Bonet case, where like the family will go after anybody that goes after them, or like in the Adnan, there's a couple other suspects that really they just stay quiet and don't do anything about it and just hope if they ignore it, it will go away.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a hard thing. What is the
right? Like, think about it for those people and their families. I recently had somebody attack me on Facebook over something, like just my personal life and my background and all that stuff. And it was somebody who was in my circle of friends. I wasn't friends with them. And that caused enormous frustration, angst, problem. Can you imagine if it were an investigation into my child's murder and you were doing that? I mean, how horrendous do you have to be? How deplorable, essentially, do you have to be to not handle those things with care? Like, there are family members, there are friends, there are boyfriends, there are girlfriends, there are mothers and their sisters. And I swear half these people would punch in the face someone who did that to one of their family members. And I've even had those conversations with people where I was like, what if I did that to your daughter? How would you feel? Like, would you be cool with that? Would you be like, all right with that?
No. So yeah, so it's just a very hard field. That it's the one that's kind of definitely one to.
There's no ethical framework. That's really the problem. There's no ethical framework. And there is an opportunity, by the way, Michael, these large organizations like CrimeCon or other groups like that, to have conversations. I don't know that they can't create or implement or regulate, but they can create conversations about what should our ethical standards be. And I think that's an important thing that probably needs to happen.
Correct. Yeah, and I don't know how that gets started. It's an organization like that. I guess it's an opportunity for you.
Yeah, I'll let you know when I get back from Nashville this year.
Well, I'm planning on going to, so I'll
see you there.
See you there.
We can knock on the same doors.
Yep. Okay, I'm thinking that's probably most of the issues that I wanted to bring up with you today. I guess, was there any others that you wanted to bring up real quickly before?
Well, I mean, one thing I wanted to say is I'm glad your podcast is here. I've been
Oh,
enjoying
thanks.
your daily roundups. I really enjoyed your
Okay.
interview with Allison Dixon, who's also somebody that I know, and I've been on her podcast. But one of the things that I really think you do a great job of is it's funny, and I feel this way about a number of people that there is a beautiful uh, thing to people like you who are so logical and who can translate things in such a layman's way for the rest of us. And I think it really brings value, and I'm glad that it's here. So,
Okay, thank you. I mean, yeah, I'm not doing daily updates. It's probably I'm gonna do
oh,
like I do weekly updates.
yep.
So it's just so trying Friday afternoons are spent to just say, hey, what happened in some of the bigger cases. I guess I need people to come to me and say, hey, can you follow this case or whatever? Because some of the bigger ones I know about, I don't know of all the smaller ones. And now Crumbly's over. Delphi has something every week, so there's always something to put on
There's
that
always
one. That one. But yeah, and so
going to heat up. They're going to be a number. Who knows what's going to happen with John Bonet? And eventually we get the Zodiac Man. I wanted to just ask you another question that I'm curious about. Like, what drives you to do this?
I I guess a couple of reasons. I guess me, I just like discussing legal issues and in cases. So I guess it's in getting into true crime. I'm not a lawyer, so but I like trying to understand it. One of the issues I'm gonna probably talk about next with somebody else is like the different types of immunity, like stuff that we don't ever really see and
Dig
talk about,
into.
and it goes into several of the cases. So that's one. I guess
Great.
also, I guess, and just trying to understand with like the Delphi, all these pre-trial motions, what they're trying to do. Like, I guess from a the non-lawyer, I don't think people always understand what they're trying to do with these motions. It's not always like they're not always trying to win them. So a
Yep.
lot of the things I'm trying to understand is that the defense attorney, when they're putting these motions in, is to say what they're going to do in court or at the trial or what they're trying to go
Or to
for.
preserve something for an appeal.
Yeah, they got to put it on the record. So it's not really to win it. It's more to like, here are the issues that got to be cleared up. And as you said,
Or sometimes it's
they go
even
to
just to build a relationship with their client because their client wants them to do it. There are all sorts of interesting.
So
That's cool.
So yeah, plus it's
Oh yeah,
sorry, and I'm more of an introvert, so this is the chance to get and do something that's more public. So
well,
sometimes I'm kind of nervous.
Secretly, I am too. A lot of people think I'm an extrovert because I can get really talkative. And I was telling somebody recently, I was like, if you look at my psychological scale, right? I score like on this scale that has to do with being like histrionic, talkative, attention seeking. And I also score on high on this scale called reserved. And I said, guys, I finally figured it out. It makes perfect sense to me. If I'm hiding from you, you can't talk to me. And if I'm talking to you nonstop, you can't talk to me. So I appreciate that like introversion piece of it. There's something about one-on-one conversations with introverts like you who I think can really listen and hear what we say. That's really powerful. So
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
I try to.
Well, do you want me to go ahead and wrap?
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and wrap this.
All right, man. Be good.
Okay.